Chahut Média. The world found nothing sacred in the abstract nakedness of being human. Hannah Arendt, The Origins of Totalitarianism, 1951.
It's been 73 years, 2 UN conventions, and 1 decade-long campaign to end statelessness since Hannah Arendt wrote this. Despite its best hopes, the UN's High Commissioner for Refugees was not able to move the world into eliminating statelessness in the last decade. Experts suspect the problem is much larger than we've been able to measure.
Now with discussions of sending asylum seekers back to where they came from.
Eva Volchold, Social Rights Program Director, Rosa Luxemburg Foundation, Geneva.
And stricter immigration laws and sometimes also stricter laws with regard to getting a nationality. And I mean, that is also something that is necessary. No, there has to be a country that is then also giving a nationality to these people wherever they are. It might get more difficult in the future. And then, like with every war, there are refugee communities that maybe in that country or in that situation cannot register the birth of their children. And that can then, under certain circumstances, also lead to more stateless people, because it's then maybe difficult also if a parent is not there anymore to track down where this child was born, who the parents were and all of that. So I think it's probably also very much connected to the war situations around the world, whether this number will rise again or not.
But there has been progress. The UNHCR published a report on statelessness in early October 2024, and they found that more than 500,000 people in the world became citizens since the beginning of the I Belong campaign in 2014. And here's what they found. Some regions of the world and some countries within those regions have blazed a trail. The UNHCR said that Kyrgyzstan was the first country in the world to just end statelessness within its borders. In the same span of time, 14 countries have acceded to the 1954 UN Convention on the Status of Stateless Persons. 18 countries have acceded to the 1961 UN Convention on the Reduction of Statelessness. This doesn't automatically translate into new nationality laws, but it is a step forward. And if nothing else, stateless people are more willing than ever to speak up, to tell their stories. We can't say we didn't know anymore. We can't say it's impossible to fix it because we have enough examples to prove that it's doable. We're running out of excuses. I am Anna Rasquet-Paz, a journalist in New York City, and this is Citizens of Nowhere, a 4-part series on statelessness supported by the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation and produced by Chahut Média. Welcome to episode 4, Bridges to Citizenship.
The Global Action Plan includes actions to resolve existing situations of statelessness, prevent new cases of statelessness from emerging, and better identify and protect stateless persons. Global Action Plan to End Statelessness, UNHCR.
As the I Belong campaign established in 2014, there are 2 major areas countries need to focus on to reduce statelessness. One of them is preventing it, typically with birth registrations. The other is changing nationality laws to create protections and paths to citizenship so as to change the status of existing stateless people. So, a good way to measure progress is to look at countries that have made efforts on both or either of these fronts. And there are many, which shows it's feasible. More than 20 countries have adopted new nationality laws, and 13 other countries have created new rules to prevent statelessness at birth. Liberia, Madagascar, and Sierra Leone have changed their laws to allow women to pass their nationality onto their children. They are exceptional enough to name check because there are still 24 other countries that have not done that. And let's also note, there's been a major legislative advance in the European Union. It is the brand new Pact on Migration and Asylum, which the EU Council adopted in May 2024. This is Chris Nash.
This EU Migration and Asylum Pact, when it was first proposed by the European Commission, 3 or 4 years ago, it had no provisions on statelessness.
Chris Nash, Director and co-founder of the European Network on Statelessness.
You did a word search, you wouldn't even find statelessness. If we fast forward now to 2024, when the package was adopted, there are several amendments or clauses that do require identification of stateless people. And we worked really hard with our members and partners to get those into the negotiation positions of the Parliament and then the Council, and to see them finally adopted.
International protection should be granted to third country nationals and stateless persons who fall under the scope of this regulation and who qualify for international protection. Regulation of the European Parliament and of the Council on standards for the qualification of third country nationals or stateless persons as beneficiaries of international protection.
Now, EU member countries have until 2026 to implement this new legislation. But some countries are moving quickly.
I think one country which does stand out, certainly in terms of its laws, is Spain. Spain recently acceded to the 1961 Statelessness Convention, but even before acceding to it, it had full safeguards to prevent childhood statelessness. So, it sort of scores very well on that front. Spain is also one of the countries which has had a stateless determination procedure for the longest, since the early 2000s. But even there's a but, in that I think Spain itself has recently acknowledged that in terms of the accessibility and how that stateless determination procedure functions, there are improvements that could be made. But, I think Spain generally has played a positive role championing statelessness, including actually when it was recently had the presidency of the EU during final negotiations on the EU Migration and Asylum Pact.
He also added a special mention for one European country outside of the European Union.
The positive law reforms that North Macedonia has made, particularly in terms of ensuring access to birth registration and closing gaps in nationality laws which were perpetuating statelessness, particularly among Roma populations who, and often we see that discrimination is both a cause and a consequence of anti-Gypsyism. Sorry, that statelessness is a cause and a consequence of anti-Gypsyism. And, having these laws in place will hopefully, help to address that.
The UNHCR said that thanks to North Macedonia's efforts, 608 people out of 786 who were at risk of statelessness are now confirmed citizens. Chris Nash also mentioned South America as one of the regions of the world that made great strides in the last decade. That's because as the UN was launching the I Belong campaign, Latin American countries were rallying around the 2014 Brazil Plan of Action. This plan of action made the eradication of statelessness a priority. The first step was to get countries like Chile, Peru, Jamaica, Colombia to accede to the 1954 and the 1961 UN conventions.
Since the start of the I Belong campaign, many states in the Americas, including Argentina, Brazil, Costa Rica, Ecuador, Panama, and Uruguay, have adopted procedures to determine statelessness. These are similar to asylum procedures for refugees, but focus on identifying and conferring a protected status on stateless persons pending their naturalization. Colombia has decided to confer citizenship on all children born there during a certain period to parents who have fled from Venezuela. This is a welcome development that benefits tens of thousands of newborns who would otherwise have been left in legal limbo. They were unable to obtain Venezuelan documentation and were technically not eligible for Colombian citizenship. Extract from Atlas of the Stateless, 2020.
With this program, Colombia gave nationality to more than 100,000 children of displaced Venezuelan parents, which is a massive achievement. That's according to the UNHCR's latest report on the I Belong campaign. Not to mention, late birth registrations have become a thing in several countries, including Argentina and Colombia. And indigenous people who live across borders in Costa Rica, Panama, and Colombia also started to have access to documentation.
An amendment to the Constitution that came into force in 2010 deprived around 250,000 people in the Dominican Republic of their citizenship. This decision, signed by 209 of the 215 senators and deputies in legislature, made 250,000 people stateless in one fell swoop. The people affected were children born in the Dominican Republic whose parents had immigrated from neighboring Haiti. Changing the Rule by Hans Ulrich Dillmann. Atlas of the Stateless, 2020.
But the Dominican Republic, where the problem of stateless people of Haitian descent makes it stand out as worst in class in the region, even loosened its registration procedure in 2023. There were setbacks. Things are far from fixed in the DR. And Nicaragua somehow reserved the right to strip its citizens of their nationality. But overall, the region has become a model to follow. Meanwhile, in Africa, Bronwyn Manby pointed to some great initiatives.
If you're in one of the former French territories in West Africa, let's say Senegal.
Bronwyn Manby, British human rights scholar and consultant specialized in comparative nationality law, statelessness, and legal identity in Africa.
The nationality code says that a person who is in possession d'état de Sénégalais, who has the apparent status of a Senegalese national, for example, you've got a family name that indicates that you might not be Senegalese, and you go and ask for your national identity card, which is very much along the French model, and the police station says, not sure about you, bring evidence. You can then go to quite a low-level court and get a certificate of nationality, bringing witnesses and evidence and whatever, and the court then issues you with a certificate of nationality, and that certificate of nationality can only be overturned on the basis of, by another court, on the basis of new evidence. And so, although, of course, that can be extremely procedural, you can spend hours waiting in the court waiting room, all of that can happen, but nonetheless, you end up with a document that says the next time you said your last name is what, you can say, here's my certificate of nationality, end of story.
For example, between 2023 and 2024, the UNHCR said Mauritania registered more than 600,000 people through easy procedures, including people who were at risk of statelessness. Bronwyn Manby has more.
In Southern Africa, both Mozambique and Namibia have really good nationality laws, and they respect them. And Namibia in particular has really taken a lot of efforts in recent years to sort out the people in the country who are not identified. So which are largely in the border zones, especially on the Angola border, which is the most highly populated, and they've really gone village to village, done an audit, tried to sort out, issued, I think, 150,000 identity documents, which in a country that's like 2 million people is a lot. And there are some along the South Africa border, some of them who were expelled from South Africa under the apartheid regime, a few people along Zambia and Botswana border as well. So Namibia has really done a systematic effort.
Namibia has adopted a registration system that is very similar to one that exists in India, called the Aadhaar Unique Identification System, where every resident of more than 3 months gets an ID, whether or not they are a citizen. That's the theory. In practice, the system's been hijacked for discrimination and surveillance by Narendra Modi's far-right government, but not in Namibia.
Let's just get everybody in the books, and then because it's politically controversial, we'll sort out nationality later. But Namibia has done this system where they've said, no, we're going to integrate them. And if we don't know the nationality of the child, the child will be registered at birth, which is, should happen immediately, without the nationality. If it's clear that the child is Namibian, we'll write that on the birth certificate, and then when they come to need a national identity card, they can just take the birth certificate. But if it's not clear, we leave it blank. Then if after 2 years we haven't been able to discover what the nationality is, then we write in Namibian. And so that's a really good system.
Let's also mention Chad, which delivered 120,000 birth certificates to children of displaced people between 2019 and 2024, according to the UNHCR. And then in the United States, the Biden administration made a small gesture, issuing guidance that some stateless people could benefit from not being deported immediately.
So the idea is that there could be a deferred action for stateless people.
David Baluarte, Senior Associate Dean for Academic Affairs at the CUNY School of Law, New York City.
And so that's an exciting development. That in and of itself is an exciting idea. It's relatively new. As far as I know, no deferred action for a stateless person has yet been issued. And I think that there is a really, really troubling limitation in what has been rolled out that essentially makes it, I don't want to say irrelevant for the vast majority of stateless people in the United States, but certainly not that significant. And that is that people can only qualify for deferred action on account of statelessness if they are not under the jurisdiction of Immigration and Customs Enforcement. So this is interesting. This is the Department of Homeland Security that rolls out this regulation for protection of stateless people in USCIS that is not for anyone who is under the jurisdiction of Immigration and Customs Enforcement.
Basically, to benefit from this guidance, a stateless person cannot have been placed under detention. And honestly, there are only very few people this concerns. But deferred action for stateless people on principle is a positive development. And last but not least is the fact that many people around the world have become aware of the problem. And that's in large part thanks to the UNHCR's I Belong campaign. Eva Wuchold of the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation.
I think it put a lot of attention towards the topic, also within the human rights community, because, the UNHCR is a huge organization focusing on many, many different issues, and it wasn't easy to put that extra focus on stateless people. And I think this campaign really helped to put it in the center of attention and was a driver also for governments to get involved, like also all those governments that were ignoring the topic before. So I think for that, it was really, really remarkable what came out of it.
I think there's certainly far greater attention on the issue than there was 10 years ago.
Chris Nash.
And we have seen significant progress, I would say, in terms of some of that increased awareness translating into law and policy reform that, provides protection to stateless people or enables them to access a nationality and thereby end their statelessness.
It's a similar story in the United States, David Baluarte says.
This is like the important work of advocates who have highlighted case after case, and the advocacy of stateless individuals, I think importantly, who are brave enough to tell their own story when so many of them live in such vulnerable situations. Now I think that you have a broader recognition that, yes, statelessness is an issue in the United States.
Clearly, there has been some progress, but the road ahead is long. The experts have recommendations. First, of course, would be for more nation-states to change their laws to account for statelessness and create a mandate to fix it.
If we're talking about nationality laws being reformed, it is doable. These are not expensive sort of measures that a state has to take. Amending legislation does not need to be expensive, but it's about when that happens, it's also making sure that, relevant officials, in terms of birth registries, passport offices, that they are properly trained and able to ensure that, stateless people then get the documentation they need. to show their entitlement to nationality.
It would be good to have like more international cooperation to solve that issue, like a more global campaign, and also to focus on the positive outcomes that this can have. I mean, if you take out those discriminatory passages from your laws, it doesn't only help stateless people, it helps women in general. And that's also true with many other things. I mean, helping stateless people by legal reforms, but also by, for example, maybe offering social services to anyone that is living in that country, and not only to the ones that have the right passport, would help many people that are also migrants or whoever that are in that country.
So, quick reminder. There are the 2 UN conventions on statelessness, one from 1954 and the one from 1961. And then there are regional agreements, some of which are still in the works. Bronwyn Manby.
There are some minimum rules of harmonisation, but at the international level, they are minimal. What I could tell you about is that in February this year, the African Union adopted a new protocol to the African Charter on Human and People's Rights on the specific aspects of the right to a nationality and the eradication of statelessness in Africa, which provides a set of principles about recognising nationality. And there is also a European Convention on Nationality, for example, so there are guidelines at the European level and now also at the African level, which do provide frameworks for harmonisation and to prevent statelessness. The African protocol, which I was involved with throughout, is really quite groundbreaking. And in particular, one of the principles establishes that the second generation born in the country should be automatically a citizen at birth.
What Bronwyn Manby is saying here is that countries getting together to solve the problem is great. But now they have to implement what they agree on. And it's one thing to register new babies, but what also matters is that countries create paths to citizenship. And that, says Chris Nash, is very tricky right now.
And a key sort of reform needed here, and which needs improvement, is facilitated routes to naturalisation. And there's a general trend in Europe where, access to naturalisation, to citizenship through naturalisation, is getting more restrictive and exclusionary. So, we've recently seen much stricter eligibility requirements introduced in, for example, Cyprus, France, and Ukraine. And this is, and proposals are on the table in Sweden. This is all in the last year or so.
Then, on an individual level, if immigration officers were trained on how to recognize and deal with statelessness, it might be easier for stateless people to stand up and be counted. And it might also prevent the dreaded game of refugee roulette that Lynn El-Khatib went through.
Doesn't matter if it's migration, if it's asylum, just have a specific trained people for it. And also,
Lynn El-Khatib, citizen of nowhere.
I think people should be a little bit more curious. If people are a bit more curious and try to read about these things just because it doesn't affect them, and then they become more aware.
It's absolutely the case that statelessness historically is little understood. Often sort of state officials, do not have a full understanding of it. Even other civil society partners working on nexus issues such as forced displacement, child rights, or anti-discrimination may not have that understanding of statelessness. And I think that it is important to differentiate between sort of identifying indications of statelessness. So I was talking about in an asylum procedure, you can't determine statelessness like at a border crossing between Greece and Turkey, but officials can be trained to recognise and record where an individual either claims to be stateless or might be at risk of statelessness because of their profile or other information that can be achieved at screening.
That has to go through raising awareness, which is what Lynn, Alexis, David's former client Milion Ethiopis, decided to do. It's very hard for stateless people to speak up because they're putting themselves in danger, but it's also very powerful when they do.
When we are disempowered and our perspectives are not heard and our expertise is not heard, all you're going to hear is the gaslighting from the state actors that don't want to take accountability.
Alexis Ivashuk, citizen of nowhere and founder of the Apatrid Network.
That's a problem in itself that we don't know. It's challenging. We need allies and partners. We need celebrities that have experienced statelessness, and there's many of them.
Alexis says that raising awareness could help with the fundamental issues, like actually getting an accurate number of people in the world who are effectively stateless. And that includes people who have a legal claim to one or more countries, but don't have the documents to prove it.
A good example is that the World Bank estimated that there's 1 billion people in the world who have no legal identification.
I looked this up, by the way. The exact number is 1.1 billion people, more than 1 person out of 8 on this planet. The World Bank gave this estimate in 2017 as part of the Identification for Development initiative.
More than 1.1 billion people in the world are unable to prove their identity and therefore lack access to vital services, including healthcare, social protection, education, and finance. The majority live in Africa and Asia, and more than a third are children who are unregistered. World Bank, October 2017.
For comparison, the UNHCR's initial estimate was 10 million stateless people globally. The last report on the I Belong campaign said that the number had gone to 4.4 million, but they recognized that this was probably a massive undercount. The UNHCR said that 18 more countries were now reporting statelessness data than in 2014, which is great, because one of the goals of the I Belong campaign was to obtain better data. But 1.1 billion is a shocking number.
So technically, that's a textbook example of de facto statelessness.
Yeah.
But this 1 billion is never counted in any statistics that they're stateless, even though people will admit, okay, yeah, they're de facto stateless, but why don't you count them?
That's a good question. Accurate numbers would force accountability. Speaking of which, I asked Bronwyn Manby about Africa's supposed worst offender on statelessness, Côte d'Ivoire. She said that they were being singled out for doing a good job of keeping track.
I don't think that's the case. I mean, I think their statistics are quite good, but the only reason, in terms of countries where a lot of people are undocumented, the Ivorian survey that found that out is literally the only one that's been carried out. So it's not surprising that it's the largest number.
So I think we should very much focus on taking statelessness and stateless people, who are definitely one of the most marginalized communities in the world,
Eva Volhold,
as like an example to solve like even bigger issues that we have. And I think that should be the driver behind it.
But it matters that we support the first concern, so they speak up. David Baluarte told us about his former client, Milian Ethiopis.
I'm so proud of him because when I met Milian, he was, I keep on reusing this sort of image of someone in the shadows, and that was Milian. Like, he was terrified to sort of like be acknowledged in public. He did an interview a number of years ago and understandably, asked that he be shaded out, like didn't even want to be on camera. He was terrified. And, and slowly over time, he became sort of not just more self-assured, but recognized more and more that he hadn't done anything wrong, that he was suffering an injustice, like repeatedly, systematically. And it was constantly, cast as something that he was doing wrong, but that he wasn't doing anything wrong. He had been brutalized by the Ethiopian government, and he had come to the United States and been just sort of like systematically denied basic human dignity. And that took a toll. It took a real toll. And then for Milian to step up and say, no, like, not only do I deserve better, but people in my situation generally deserve better. And then you saw Milian, from this first interview that was blurred out to Milian now appearing on the webpage of United Stateless with all of the other founding members and sort of consistently making this claim for human dignity, for human rights, for stateless people. And United Stateless received some very important funding so that they could hire a lawyer.
Lynn Al-Khatib experienced that too, and she now tries to encourage other stateless people to tell their stories. She's learned that empathy leads to action.
Storytelling is a very powerful thing that can touch people, and not in a way that manipulates emotions, but to see that we are flesh and bones, we do exist. We're not the ones that are invisible, it's the society and the system that made us unseen. We have a lot of trying to raise awareness and stuff, and we get a lot of good feedback from people that never heard about this before to people that are actually stateless and they didn't know that other people exist. So I think our strength now is the community work, is to bring stateless people together, because statelessness can be so lonely. And when you see someone else, like if someone else hear this podcast today and they've been to the same situation as I am and they feel like, wait a minute, I'm the only one, this gives a lot. But this is, we're talking about the human, we normal people level. If we're talking about officials, there's a lot of work to be done.
For the poor and disenfranchised, membership in a state is as important as ever. The ability to move across borders manifests global patterns of inequality. Some people can collect dozens of passports, while others languish without one. Today's legally stateless are often excluded from basic national provisions such as employment and education. Lacking passports and birth certificates, they are unable to make claims on the state and become vulnerable to a variety of predatory practices, such as trafficking. Mira Siegelberg, Statelessness, A Modern History, 2020.
It really doesn't need to be this way. Solutions exist. We know what to do. And as Chris Nash said, it's not that expensive. People who have the right to live and work in a country can contribute to society, pay taxes, take care of themselves and their families. David Baluarte adds that the solutions are ready to go.
One of the remarkable things about this problem, and I've always felt this is one of those issues that is so solvable. It's so solvable. Like, the legislation's already written, and it's not a huge number of people. And guess what? They're here anyway. I mean, it's one of those things. And so many people, when I spend enough time talking to them, pretty much everyone gets it. Right? They understand, like, oh yeah, these are people who are members of our community. For all of the reasons that have left them stateless, there's nowhere, unless we're going to herd people up and put them on a ship and take them out into the middle of the ocean. There is nowhere for them. They are members of our community. It's not an unbelievable number of people. We already talked about the range. You're talking about a relatively discrete population that are our neighbors, do live with us, are a permanent part of our community. And we have an easy fix for recognizing them and providing them an on-ramp to being complete members of our community. All of the work is already done. We just need the political will to just do it.
Yeah.
And the cost is minimal. And there's virtually no effort involved. And these are wonderful members of our community who deserve this minimal gesture.
Yeah. It's surely just inconceivable that some people don't get to join the club. There can't be any justification for it. Obviously, statelessness is just one of many rights issues, and in an increasingly polarized political context. But I think there's something particularly insidious about being denied the right to have rights, essentially. In terms of, if we don't address that elephant in the room, this could be, if we're talking about work to ensure gender equality or inclusion or or a host of other issues. Too often statelessness isn't the elephant in the room.
This issue belongs to all of us. It holds up a mirror to the political questions we asked and bureaucratic answers we gave. It forces us to recognize one of the luxuries we enjoy, having documents and an official identity. Statelessness is born of so many of the ills we struggle with: xenophobia, racism, sexism, climate change, war. It exists in our biggest blind spots. And what those who understand it well have taught me is that we will never fully confront our prejudices unless we tackle this as a priority. Statelessness, Citizens of Nowhere, a Rosa Luxemburg Foundation podcast series, written and hosted by Anna Rasquat-Paz, edited and produced by Chahut Media.